right. Hello and welcome back to Kumba Hineni, a podcast with intersectionality, more than just skin deep. I am your host, Enzi, and this week we will be chatting it up with my friend and colleague, Rabbi Jessica Rosenberg. We will be discussing solidarity with Indigenous communities. Welcome, Rabbi Jessica Rosenberg, and I'd love to introduce yourself and hear a little bit about you.
Thank you so much, Enzi. It is such a joy to be with you always. And I'm really honored to be on this podcast. The interviews that you've done so far and the teaching you've done is such a gift to our Jewish communities. So thank you for that and making the space and inviting me to be here.
Thank you.
Yes, my name is Rabbi Jessica Rosenberg, and I am the daughter of Shelley and Ken, Zichrona Livracha. I'm currently on Dakota land known as Minnesota Makoche, where the water reflects the sky. Also home to the Anishinaabe people, and I'm also sitting a few blocks from George Floyd Square. And feels important as we're talking about solidarity, that be very place specific, especially Indigenous solidarity, but really all solidarity, in order to not be an abstract concept, to know who you're in solidarity with and to place myself here. And yeah, I currently get to work and organize and write and teach and scheme and dream in a lot of different places. I'm proud of my work with the Radical Jewish Calendar, which is for sale now, and a way to move into Jewish time together. And I'm honored always to organize with you at Jewish Community Action for community safety. And I'm also, as we'll talk about today, really grateful to be part of the movement to stop Line 3.
Awesome. Thank you for introducing yourself. And I'm excited to hear so much about all of these things in the context of this podcast, because some of this I've heard about and some of it I might not have. And also, I just want to state, because Indigenous is a very uh, large term. And so, to follow up with what Jessica said, we will be specifically talking about the context of the United States and Turtle Island, and potentially Canada. I'm not sure. We haven't talked about that. But we're speaking specifically a North American, um, above Mexico standpoint. So Canada and the United States. So, first question I have for you, and this is really broad, but when you think of really what got you into wanting to do solidarity work with Indigenous communities?
So I first learned about solidarity with Indigenous people here living in Minneapolis. I grew up on Lenape land in the suburbs of Philadelphia, and I only there learned about Native American and Indigenous cultures and community in a past and historical tense, and never learned about contemporary Indigenous peoples, including all the way up like through college, through coming into young adulthood, of being connected to racial justice and gender justice movements. And
So I
then
want to so I want to ask a question, because it's, as you're saying, it's just really resonating with me and reminding me that in many ways, particularly within non-Jewish community, within a Christian nationalist society, the way in which people oftentimes teach about Jewish folks is in the same way, in a sense of a past tense, no longer existing, and just naming how that is challenging, especially when that's all you see and know.
yeah, right, because how can you be in solidarity with or support people who don't exist anymore? Like, it's very convenient for the forces that for oppressive forces, for settler colonialism, for Christian domination. Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, when I started getting involved in organizing in Minneapolis, it was really noticeable to me that this was a thing that people did and talked about. And it was actually this group, Unsettling Minnesota, which was a study group and study and action group of settlers, people who were settler identified or understood themselves as settlers. And their source book is still up online. I think we can share that in some fashion here. And it was the first time that I'd heard people identify as settlers, to be like, that's the position I'm in. I'm a settler on stolen land. And it just really opened my mind and view. And I think that was also probably how I first learned about the work of what's now Makochi Ikikupi, Dakota, used to be the Dakota Land Project, a reparative justice on Dakota land, which is a group of Dakota folks who are um, reclaiming Indigenous land and Dakota language and culture. Read the book "What Does Justice Look Like" by Wazia Tawan, and basically had to relearn history, relearn what I was taught, which I think is most of our experiences. Many people experience this. So I think it's just good to like normalize that and name that the histories that we've been taught about everything, about slavery, about colonization, for most of us, especially white folks, is very incomplete. So I did a lot of learning for a lot of years, and uh, it's really in the last few years that I think I've been able to take a slightly more active role, and also just naming. Um, I feel like a very newbie to this concept and movement, and uh, really excited to talk about kind of like what's happening, especially in a Jewish context, and then also what we can vision together for the future of solidarity with Indigenous struggles.
Yeah, that sounds really important. Not sounds, it is very important. And, I've thinking about a lot of things, but one of the things that resonates or that I've been thinking a lot about is this notion of a settler colonizer. And really, for me, as a black, as a person of, descendant of enslaved Africans, the question of um, what, the question of can property be settler colonizers has been a complex question I've asked. But for me, recently, it's really been the past matters in some context, but not really. And really looking at what does, as like the same way I look at what does Black liberation look like. I've been really curious about how do we actualize Indigenous liberation,
Mm,
which I don't know what that means, right? Just like it's hard for me to navigate what does Black liberation mean, but really the importance, especially now as our Native siblings are really in pain as they're um, uncovering thousands of their kids.
yeah.
Just really, really wanting to just for myself to remember the importance of the past doesn't matter as much when it comes to what does it look like to stand with and in solidarity with, even knowing that there could be conflict or whatever. So
Hmm. Yeah, I think about that a lot. I think something that you hear from white folks, from settler white European descendant people, in both thinking about reparations for slavery and also land back, Indigenous and Native movements for land back, is this idea like, well, that was the past and I wasn't around then. And what I think about is like we're paying taxes to this government now. We're electing people who are deciding things about borders and property and making laws, and it's not past. It's present like this, and it again it's like very visible in the Line 3 fight, that it's our current system that is undermining Indigenous sovereignty on what land that remains after I believe that there is massive reparations needed for the original act of genocide against Indigenous people, and also their current struggles happening, and, reparations and healing for stolen children in the boarding schools, all as you just named. So there's historical harm that needs to be reckoned with, that we are all
mhm.
have a role to play in. And then there's also the current struggles for land, for water, for sacred sites, for sovereignty. Um, yeah, so I think just as you're saying, it's like both this history and then also this present moment and what we can do in this present moment.
Yeah, and I'm gonna ask you really soon um, to kind of go into a little detail about line three because not everyone may not know
Mm-hmm.
what it is. But when I think about the present moment, particularly, and this notion of harm done and healing, is also for me important to name um, that their healers, right, past and historically was stripped away,
Mm.
and the ability to practice indigenous religion was illegal
Yep.
in the U.S., and that's um, very important to name because it's not things that we teach very often, and uh, there's a lot of harm that has constantly been done. Currently, there are a ton of treaties
Mm-hmm.
that the U.S. does not honor. And so just wanting to name that while we did talk about some of this as the past and et cetera, again, just like Rabbi Jessica said, this is ongoing. And some of these things um, are just now in many ways, right? The boarding schools is probably a really good, unfortunate analogy of that is all uncovering all the things that has been hidden. And at some point, we will have um, Indigenous folks on to talk specifically with. So I want to name that.
Mm-hmm.
But we wanted to start off with talking about solidarity. So I feel like line three has been going on for a while. And then I'm like, wait, is that the same thing? Because things happen. So can you just explain a little bit about line three and what it is?
Yeah, I will do my very best. So, the fight to stop line three has been going on for about 7 years in the planning and the courts process, and so that's where you're like, "Is this been going on for a while?" Yes, and Indigenous folks, especially this mostly goes through Anishinaabe land in what's known as northern Minnesota, have been fighting this for years. And the fight has picked up in the last year because construction started, and in particular after the winter free, they had to kind of pause over the winter and spring here, and then this summer it really picked up. So line 3 is a Canadian tar sands oil pipeline stretching, run by Enbridge, a Canadian corporation, going from Canada through northern Minnesota into Wisconsin. And this part that's being built right now is the last part of the pipeline to be built. Enbridge is calling it a replacement pipeline for a previous pipeline, but it runs a pretty different route, actually a vastly different route. You can see on maps. And they have no cleanup plan for the old pipeline, and it's atrocious in so many ways. So it is violates Anishinaabe treaty lands. It destroys ecosystems. It is absolutely unconscionably dangerous for the climate and for the future of basically all life. Like the pipeline, um, the oil that it transports is the equivalent of 50 coal plants a day or some such thing. It's like yeah, just a real disaster, and it is moneyed interests pushing it through, and our governor Waltz and Biden ignoring it and letting it happen. And the resistance to line 3 has been led by Indigenous, mostly Anishinaabe women and Two-Spirit people who have established a series of resistance camps along the route of the pipeline and have been engaging in direct action and prayer and uh, documenting the many instances of frack outs and spills in the construction, um, and have called on non-native folks to join them in solidarity. And I've been really honored to have uh, been up for two relatively short visits and taken part in actions. And that is what is happening with line 3. And I'll pause there.
Awesome. Thank you. That was a really good. Thank you for the historical background as well, because that makes sense now. Where I was like, this has been
Yeah.
some time, and it's also good to know that folks and we'll figure out how to tell folks how. But there's ways, right, to
Mm-hmm.
get involved, and in many ways it is extremely important, uh, because oftentimes what I have observed is when it comes to particularly within Native and Indigenous things, we tend to have a very bad memory about uh, things that are happening, and I am not perfect, but I really always try, and am really intentionally trying to do better, and just naming that speaking about this as often as possible for me is important, so it could stick in our brains of
Mm-hmm.
what does what does it look like, how do or can we stand, especially when much of order and law that we talk about, it is rooted in following, right, laws and agreements and treaties, and so it's just still amazing that that is not happening, as well as for folks who are listening, who may whatever wherever you stand, but who may be more progressives, um, figuring out or thinking about how do you hold our elected officials accountable for these things? Can you write letters? Should Is that something that folks should be doing right now?
Yeah, so there's definitely sending messages to the White House, sending to the governor, also to the Minnesota Pollution Control Board, also to the Army Corps of Engineers to get them to pull the permits. There are definitely actions to take, and I think this will be released in time to invite people to an action at the Capitol in St. Paul on August 25th. Will be There's a walk for water happening right now, of people coming from the pipeline route and walking for 2 weeks, and building power along the walk. There is a Jewish delegation coming for part of that walk and joining in. Um, and That will be culminating at the Capitol on the 25th. And I think also actions in other cities at that same time. Uh, yeah, and I've also just to say, I think with a lot of struggles, we can feel like we don't know enough to speak up, and I think, especially given the history of how much non-native folks are not taught about contemporary indigenous life and struggle, it can feel really easy to feel like you don't know enough. And just want to invite people to step into humbly participating, even without knowing everything, can still show up. And I think, yeah, the concept of treaties, I think as Jewish people and our relationship to Brit, to covenant,
Mm.
that agreements should be sacred. And it's really atrocious to see both, like, just the egregious violation of even the laws that Minnesota and the US have about, which is, we know not enough about environmental protection and indigenous rights, and even those ones being violated for the sake of money accumulation.
It's amazing when I think about. I'm not sure up until maybe more recently. I've been watching a lot of David Attenborough, who is this brilliant British commentator. He's like 95, I believe. He does all of the Mind Planet series,
Um,
and so watching him and really been really fixated on deep sea and deep ocean stuff, and so um, really not being aware of how climate and everything had been drastically impacting stuff, and have just really been mindful of how we're almost at a place and a point to where our planet is irreversible, and some of the um, damage and harm that has been done. And indigenous cultures have known how to protect our lands, and then like it's we're all suffering from the
mhm.
ways in which Line 3 will impact and has impacted, and just the way in which the earth and the climate is just drastically impacted by uh, perhaps maybe our greed or our need to constantly expand. I'm not sure.
Well, that maybe it's a good time to talk about the Shemitah year coming and Jewish frames for Indigenous solidarity, which I'd love to.
Let's do it
Let's
because
do it.
yeah,
Yeah, so it's always a good time to organize Jewish communities and to support Indigenous sovereignty, and now is a very good time to do it. Because we're heading into when Rosh Hashanah starts at the year 5782. It'll be a Shemitah year, which in the biblical tradition, we have this offering of we work the land for 6 years, and then on the seventh year we let it rest. And part of that rest is also a release of debts. And every seventh year of seven, so the 50th year after 49 years, we have a jubilee year where all the land gets returned to its original owners, stewards, and I know a lot of people already are and will spend part of this year studying the both economic and spiritual offering of Shemitah. Uh, One of the things I love about it is that it shows an economic system from before capitalism that our Jewish tradition offers us, and a different relationship to land where we don't own the land. We uh, tend it while we are here, and we do that only at the grace of Hashem, of God, um, and that we have to live ethically on the land and honor the kind of traditional ways of the land. And I think it's a really important time to say, what does that mean for those of us who are not native to this land? How do we honor the Shemitah year? Um, for me, the opportunity both to work for reparations for slavery of uh, African people on this land, and also to work for land back for Indigenous people, is a way that honors the Shemitah, the tradition of Shemitah. And I'm really feel really moved that I can remember 7 years ago now, and want to lift up Lincoln Fligel, the queer diaspora chicken farm that started 7 years ago and was timed themselves on Shemitah. And they were the only folks I knew doing that then. And since then, now uh, there's just, I think, like a ton of work happening to bring Jews into more work that honors organizing and learning that honors Shemitah.
I love that. I think that's beautiful and very important. I get really excited about the Shemitah year. I don't know why,
Ooh,
but it's just so much possibility and
yeah.
so much um, just chance for just renewal and whatever that means. And so it seems exciting as well as it makes perfect sense.
Mhm.
And what better year after uh, you know 2020 after 2020 or 5781, however we want to say it,
Mhm.
was very challenging and
Yeah.
struggling.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, it's interesting because it's both this invitation to rest and also to release. And so I'm hearing really great questions about how do we both move forward the work of reparations and land back while also ourselves participating in rest uh, and release for ourselves. And I think that that's a great question for us to practice this year.
mhm. Yeah, that is a good question, especially to think about and wrestle with, and try to constantly ask ourselves that question. So one of the things I just want to name as we talk about this, and we we talk about this all the time, and it's we're naming it because it seems obvious, right? But just naming that when we talk about the Jewish community, we're talking about a multiracial, multicultural um, community, and so we do have
Mm-hmm.
indigenous Jews living in Minneapolis,
Yep.
right? So just naming that we have such a broad community, and if I can say a little bit about it, but I also want to name the importance of that, as well as Rabbi Jessica. Curious if you have any extra thoughts about the growing attention to maybe centering Jews of color, as well as being mindful of Black and Indigenous struggle in a way that we're finally saying our Jewish community is more than just.
Yeah, thank you for naming that. Yeah, I think that's I'm trying to remember, and I'm sure I'm not getting it right all the time, to talk about Jewish organizing in support of indigenous sovereignty, not necessarily as solidarity. So for if we're organizing Jewish communities for indigenous sovereignty, some folks are doing that in solidarity who are non-native folks, and some folks are doing that as indigenous folks who are fighting for their own rights to be uh, acknowledged and land rights and land claims to be honored. And so I think as we, those of us who want our Jewish community to honor all, all of our community and family, um, to for people, for individuals who are doing it in solidarity, or for groups if that's your position, to name that, and then also to be clear that, yeah, all of what you just said, that Jewish community includes uh, is a multiracial community and includes indigenous people, people who are indigenous to this land. And I think the question for me is always like, how do we not wait for those people to be in the room before doing the work and before naming, or not just how, like, let's not let's not wait until BIPOC people are in the room to
Mhm.
do this work and to talk about it.
And it's a challenge. It's a large. I want to name that I typically, when things happen, I try to share um, on social media things from directly from folks impacted.
Yep.
And I want to name that it was really hard around the stuff with the boarding schools because I wasn't seeing much of anything until a friend was like, "No one is posting. This is a native fair," and I was like, "Oh, you know what? I don't need to wait. I just will
Mm,
post." And really the pain that folks have been really pushing and saying even today that there was more concern about the 215 than the 50,
mm,
the over the 5200 plus, and just naming the why it's important to just to do it, and to
mhm,
find ways to stand in solidarity. We're using the language of solidarity because um, we're two people who were not who are not indigenous and weren't raised indigenous, and just naming that so it's from this lens, and it's just important.
mhm.
And it can be scary to step in, right? It can
Yeah,
be scary to and knowing that mistakes are going to be made,
yeah.
knowing that it's okay to do what you think is right, and if someone says, especially if an indigenous person says that caused harm, accept that gift of
Mhm.
pushback, um, and address it and move forward, because this is not nothing in life is going to be
Yeah,
simple. So yeah, just naming that.
yeah. That's been something that so folks are still very much invited to go up north to, if you're able, to go to the Line 3 fight in person. And there are trainings that you can go to online every, I think it's Tuesday and Sunday, but I'll double check. And it's a group of trainings run by mostly non-native folks, saying kind of like, when you come up, here's what to expect. And um, my experience has been that's been really awesome teachers in the realm of like, these are indigenous led, and you're coming into
Hmm.
space where you're being invited to come if you can um, honor that leadership, their leadership, and also bring yourself as you are, and show up ready to also participate, and not letting the fear of getting it wrong keep you from this really vital frontline fight, that
Hmm.
we need to show up and push ourselves to show up even when it's hard. And I think for myself, that's the only way to learn how to do it.
Hmm.
Or that's what, there's like actually, reading and listening and going to trainings, and then also trying to show up in spaces and learn by doing.
Yeah, those are learning by doing is very important, and I'm going to say it over and over. When we learn by doing, we're going to make mistakes,
Mm,
uh, and that is okay. It is how we learn. Yes,
I feel like that's a perfect segue to like name that we're in Elul and maybe
that's what I was
on okay. um yeah, I think that this time of year is also a really important one for non-native folks to deepen learning about colonization and solidarity with indigenous people, because we have this frameworgoing in Jewish tradition of teshuva, of return, which literally means return and is used as we understand it to make repair. Something that I love about Teshuvah is that in a Jewish framework, when we miss the mark, we're not bad people. We're not sinful people. We are still always sparks of the divine. And we say every morning, Elohai neshama shenatata bi tohorahi. My God, the soul that you gave me is tahor, is pure. And when we miss the mark, we've done just that. We've like behaved in a way that has caused harm, and we need to be accountable for that harm. And also, we have tools for that. We have frameworks for that, and it doesn't mean that we're bad people. And I bring that to this conversation because I think there can be such overwhelming guilt and shame that come up when we
Mhm.
look at colonization, when we think about when we start to really try to uncover how much violence has been done and try to get our hearts and heads around our role in that, can be both the grief and fear and the overwhelm, and how can we even begin to make teshuva. And for me, I think knowing every day is an opportunity to make teshuva.
Mhm.
Everyone has to make it in our lifetime. There's nobody who doesn't make teshuva. um, and there's some really concrete ways to participate in teshuva for colonization. We can support indigenous led movements like Stopping Line 3, like land back movements. We can pay land taxes on the places we live. We can support indigenous art and language and cultural and health and environmental movements. Even just kind of like learning the movement that's happening where you are and how to and starting to step into it. This is part of teshuva, and it's always the season, but especially now the season to step into that.
Yeah, and just naming the like, or reiterating the importance of that. And for some reason, when we talk about issues of um, issues that are perceived as racial justice issues, that is when, um, at least in the United States, that is when folks become really anxious,
Mm,
and um, that's when it seems harder to make mistakes. And I just DJ J Smooth, said something years ago that I won't ever forget, and it was talking about uh, racial justice and when people make mistakes. And what he said is when a person has something stuck in their teeth, and you say, "Yo, you have something in your teeth." Oftentimes, we don't say, "It's not possible. I don't have bad hygiene. I have really great dental hygiene." We don't. We just remove the piece of
hmm
thing that we have stuck in our teeth. Likewise, when it comes to racism, or color, like whatever we're talking about, being mindful that, oh, this doesn't mean I'm a bad person. I just did something that caused harm. That's it. And it's just so important to look at that. And for me, especially with even with my coaching, is really trying to get people to have a um, less of a judgmental reaction to the things that they do. Still hold yourself accountable, right, and respond
hmm
to when you cause harm, but not getting caught up in being a bad person, because then that
hmm
actually prevents us from moving forward in ways that is important. So this next question, I'm not really sure how to ask it, but I'm just going to ask it. And if you even know the answer, do you see? This is really a question about the institutional Jewish community. Um, do you see any? Is there any institutional pieces of our community that's working on
mm
indigenous solidarity and sovereignty uh, that I don't know about? And also, I'm going to name that we typically on the show don't talk a lot about Judaism, but
You
um,
don't?
Sometimes we do, sometimes we don't. But no. I'm actually. It's funny because I'm saying this because when I uh, get with some people, I just get really nerdy out about Torah and stuff, and so this is actually really fun and enjoyable. So
Oh, good. Um, so Jewish community where this work is happening. I want to first lift up Jews on a Lonely Land, which is a project out of what's known as the Bay Area, Ohlone Land in California. And they've done really incredible work to bring Jewish community there into active solidarity with Indigenous people. They have a goal of getting every Jewish person in the Bay Area to participate in pay shumi, which is the land tax to the Segorite Land Trust, to an Indigenous woman-led land trust that works on the return of Indigenous land to Indigenous people. And Jews on Ohlone Land was set up to specifically do education within Jewish community and then action getting every Jewish person to pay that land tax. And I just think that's really a wonderful model of organizing your own people. Like not waiting for other people to come and move the Jewish community, but saying like, okay, this fund exists. Indigenous women are saying very much what they need, and we're going to put our resources to moving our people. So that's one really amazing example. I was honored to participate last weekend in a day-long day of study from Reconstructing Judaism about reparations that included both learning about uh, reparations for slavery and also land back and Indigenous sovereignty and reparations. And uh, I know a number of communities of synagogues that are experimenting with doing land acknowledgements and how to do them in a non performative way, but in a way that actually brings the community into taking action to support local Indigenous people. Um, I'm sure there's more examples. Those are the ones that I know to lift up. And my hope is that if you ask me again, this in a year, we'll have so many more examples. And then also just to say it's interesting, like the first group that I mentioned, Unsettling Minnesota, definitely had a bunch of Jews in it. We were, and that was like a secular political mixed group and not explicitly a Jewish group. So I know there are folks that want to honor people, all kinds of Jews who take action here in different ways. Yeah, and I think like I would love when we think about the Jewish institutional world that we own land, we have JCCs and federations and schools and summer camps, and to imagine what it would look like for all of those institutions for some people actually give land back, to deed the land we have to Indigenous people, to pay real rent, to pay a land tax, pay them. If you're on Indigenous land, you can move money to the original stewards of that land. And I'm excited to see that. I think it's starting to happen, and I would love to see it grow.
yeah, that's very exciting, and it is slowly starting to happen. And like you, I would like to see it grow more. This has been such a great conversation, and I will be thinking a lot about this for some time to come and really, which is great, right? Because it's a great time to think and process through things. Thank you so much, Rabbi Jessica. This has been such a great conversation. Is there anything that you would like to say before we close out?
Yeah, I want to first of all say thank you to you, Enzi, and to everybody who makes this podcast possible. It's really amazing to open up this space. And what I've loved about this conversation, also listening in on your other conversations, is that there's curiosity and humility, and also running towards the struggles that need our hands and heart on them, while also staying open and curious and humble to learning. And to me, that is just such an inspiring way of moving in the world. And I want to invite everyone who's listening to bring that to supporting Indigenous-led struggles for justice, for land, for water, for sovereignty, for cultural healing, for truth telling. We have so many wise people and talented organizers and resources in our tradition that can support us in staying present in these struggles. And so grateful to be in it with you and with so many other amazing people.
Thank you so much, Rabbi Jessica. Just to reiterate, I really wanted to encourage folks to lean into curiosity as you're doing this work. And whatever that means for you, just lean into it because it is one of the best ways for me to enter into the things that we can do. This has been such an amazing conversation about Indigenous solidarity, Indigenous sovereignty, and just want to remind you all about the event that we talked about earlier, which is treaties, not tar sands. It's at the Capitol. Action to Stop Line 3. It's at the Minnesota State Capitol Wednesday, August 25th, 2021 at 2 p.m. And we will have the link in the show notes for you all. Again, this is Enzi. Welcome. Thank you again for listening to Kumba Hineni, a podcast on intersectionality, more than just skin deep. And we will chat with you all next time. Thank you. Kumba Hineni, a podcast on intersectionality, more than just skin deep, is a part of the Jew Folk Podcast Network, a product of Jew Folk Inc. You can email the show at podcast@tcjewfolk.com. For more information, go to tcjewfolk.com/podcast.